right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming. We're a little tight on time. I'm sure people are still trickling in here, but I'm going to go ahead and get us started anyway. So thank you for joining us to confront the year's most prevalent threats. We're going to be broadly talking about some of the top trends, threats, and techniques we detected in the first half of 2024. See if I can get these slides to move. There we go. So Alex, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Alex. I'm the Senior Intel Manager for the intelligence team here at Red Canary.
Yeah, I'm Sam Straka. I'm a Principal Product Manager working on identity and other stuff here at Red Canary.
And I'm Brian Donohue. I am a Principal Security Specialist here at Red Canary, so I kind of do deep surveillance on our CERT and product teams to find sort of interesting educational content for us to come out here and talk about. So stuff like we're going to be doing today. So what are we going to be doing today? Well, we're going to start off with like a really quick preface on where the data that we're going to be talking about today came from. Then we're going to switch over to Alex. She's going to talk about some of the threats that we've seen in the first half of this year. I'm going to then take over and talk about some of the MITRE ATT&CK techniques that we've seen. Sam's going to sort of open the hood on Red Canary here at the end, and he's going to talk about how we do identity detection here, what we've learned about identities, and sort of how we use the information we've learned to build an identity detection product. And the information he's talking about will be broadly useful to anybody who's sort of struggling or working on bolstering their identity detection or security program. And then at the very end, you all can ask any questions. However, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, you can go ahead and ask them in the, you should have a little Q&A option in your little interface. So you can go ahead and ask those questions there, and we'll try to get to them as they come in. Just so everyone knows, this is being recorded. We'll share a copy of the recording with everyone after the fact. So where's the data come from? We released about a month ago the first edition of our threat detection report mid-year update. So traditionally in the spring, every year we release a threat detection report. This year and moving forward, we're going to release a shorter, lighter version of it that's a little higher level in the fall. So the data we're talking about today came from detections or threats we detected in the first half of the year. So from January through the end of June. And a Red Canary detection, or a threat we might call it, includes a lot of data. And two of the key points of data that we're going to be focusing on today are kind of metadata. So attack techniques. So when we have detection analytics, like the code that we use to catch threats or potential threats, I guess you should say, those are all mapped to MITRE ATT&CK. So any confirmed threat detection may be mapped to one or more of those. The other piece of metadata that we're going to be talking about a bit today is named threat associations. And this is actually a relatively small percent of the total detections because we tend to detect things early and shut them down before we're really able to make any sort of attributional estimation. So just important to realize, like, we are in the business of threat detection and response. We are not in the business of attribution. So we detect a lot of threats where we don't know what the named threat is. And I've already done the confusing thing where I'm using threat in two different ways. So allow me to kind of explain that really simply. So if you think about the structure of this the report and kind of how we're going to be talking today, is there's this big trend that you're going to see that goes throughout this whole presentation, and that's identity abuse. And there are numerous different threats that sort of contribute to that trend, right? So Mimikatz is a threat that targets credentials. And Mimikatz also leverages, adversaries who are leveraging Mimikatz are leveraging techniques at the same time, right? So with Mimikatz, we often see PowerShell abuse, credential dumping. Atomic Stealer is another threat. We often see adversaries who are using Atomic Stealer leveraging AppleScript. They're stealing credentials from web browsers. They're obfuscating files or information. And then this question mark bit over here is to represent the fact that a lot of the times we don't know what specific threat we're looking at, right? So for things like cloud accounts, email forwarding rules, email hiding rules, we don't necessarily know what threat group is responsible for that activity. There may be companies out there that are tracking those groups. They may just be sort of onesie-twosie adversaries who are doing this. Hard to say. Now, the one thing I want to point out, because I've already made a mess of this, is that this idea of threats, we kind of have two meanings for it confusingly at Red Canary. And I like to think of it as uppercase T threats and lowercase t threats. So uppercase T threats are like your named malware, your threat groups, Atomic, Stealer, Storm, whatever in Microsoft's nomenclature. And then lowercase t threats are like anything we detect, right? So sometimes we call those detections, which is also confusing in its own way because like some people, when they say detections, they're talking about detection analytics. We call those detectors. So just know that we will sometimes say detections. That's a threat that we detected, a confirmed threat at a customer. Sometimes we'll call it threats. We'll also use threats to refer to like named specific threats. It probably won't be confusing in the context of this presentation, but I wanted to explain it ahead of time. So why don't we switch over to Alex to talk about some capital T threats. Actually, she's going to lead off talking about sort of identity as a top trend and then jump into the threats.
All right. Yeah. So just to start off, one thing that you'll see through the rest of this presentation is that identity is a real top trend that we've been seeing across both the threats that we're observing as well as the techniques. All right. So why are threat actors going after identities? So the game for a lot of threat actors used to be that they were phishing the user, they were dropping malicious backdoors through their phishes onto the endpoint. But the EDR and MDR industries got really good at detecting the execution of backdoors. So adversaries have really been moving from hacking in to being able to log in. And so identity access management, identity providers, and SSO solutions have been a real boon for security. They've really made it easier to broker access, monitor access, take access away, implement MFA across your organization. But on the flip side of that, adversaries know that identities are the keys to SaaS apps, to cloud, to all the places that your data is stored. So really for most organizations, properly securing identities should be a top priority, and really understanding your IDP and IAM configurations and security, because one really good identity can access all of the things. So how are bad guys compromising identities? So we're seeing a lot of the same ways that are very familiar: phishing, malware, data leaks, brute force, etc. But now that MFA is starting to be implemented across a lot of organizations, we're starting to see a lot more MFA abuse. And so things like exploiting the help desk, this is when an adversary will call an organization's help desk and try to get them to register a new MFA device. Also, SIM swapping, that's an old risk for financial institutions and cryptocurrency. But a new risk across enterprise. And it's particularly difficult to defend against because adversaries are exploiting the process at the cell phone carrier and not at the actual organization. And cell phones are just hard to monitor. This is usually, this is specific for those SMS-based MFA. And there are now regulations on the cell phone carriers to help stop this happening. And then of course, phishing the user. So trying to get that user to give up their credentials, either through a mirrored website, pushing notifications to them, actually calling the user, anything like that. And all of this has really created this huge initial access broker ecosystem. And these are just adversaries that are trying to get those credentials, gain initial access, and then selling that access on the dark web to actors that are going to do further nefarious activities. So now let's look into the top threats that we saw in the first half of this year. So as Brian mentioned, when we say threats, we group together malware, tools, threat groups, and those are all grouped together into this big category of threats. And for the first half of the year, 6 of the top 10 threats are web or browser specific threats. And these are often specifically focused on gaining that access to those privileged identities. So going along with our trend of identities. And adversaries will often pivot from these initial access browser-specific threats into endpoints or cloud applications for data theft, extortion, ransomware, etc. And so from here, we're going to dive into the three, primarily the 3 highlighted threats that are on the slide. So as I mentioned, 6 of the top 10 are what we are grouping as browser skullduggery. And these can range from browser hijackers to adware to fake update scams to stealers aimed at stealing passwords from your browsers. And so although browser hijackers and adware can be relatively benign, they're something that we like to keep an eye on at Red Canary because they can change the browser settings and they can gain accesses that enable additional malicious downloads. So for example, we have found that endpoints with PUP detections or potentially unwanted programs are more likely to have malicious detections. So browser hijacking, as the name suggests, forces browsers to navigate to sites the user did not attend to. And these will also directly affect browser settings. And so the big example on our list is Chrome Loader for this. Adware will display unwanted advertisements, and they can generate revenue for their developers through pay-per-view, pay-per-click, pay-per-install models. And one good example of that is AdLoad, which is not on our top 10 for the first half of the year, but has been on some of our monthly top 10s. Stop Golish and Scarlet Goldfinch, they both leverage a fake browser update scam where they try to get the user to, they trick the user into downloading malicious executables posing as important browser updates. And then finally, stealers like Atomic Stealer, they're really designed to target sensitive information on a browser or endpoint. And Atomic Stealer is specifically optimized to steal that valuable browser data like credentials and cookies. So Chrome Loader was our #1 threat for the first half of this year. We like to keep an eye on Chrome Loader because its aim is really to hide and mislead. And so we believe it to be nefarious because of that, if not even more sinister. So it will redirect searches for popular search engines like Google, Bing, and Yahoo, and send search data to its command and control. And it will also prevent the user from uninstalling itself. It's oftentimes surreptitiously installed under the guise of unrelated free software. So just this activity of hiding, not allowing the user to easily delete it or remove it is really why we consider this to be a threat. And even more so, we have observed Chrome Loader downloading new payloads even weeks after that initial install. Scarlet Goldfinch, another one on our top list, and a new arrival. So this is a cluster of activity that we've been observing since June 2023, and it's the one where it's deceiving users into downloading a file that's masquerading as that browser update. Usually this starts a chain of activity that eventually leads to Net Support Manager. Net Support Manager is a remote monitoring and management tool, and this basically is a tool that is being used legitimately by organizations for that remote monitoring and management. And so adversaries can use it and have a veneer of legitimacy, but basically it's giving them a backdoor into the environment. So just going into the intrusion chain really quick. So the initial access for Scarlet Goldfinch occurs when a user is redirected from a compromised website to an adversary-controlled site, and then the site tells them to update their web browser by downloading the content on the page. And this is usually with a JScript. Once the user downloads and launches the update JScript, it executes the PowerShell commands to unpack a zip archive. We've also seen more recently Scarlet Goldfinch not utilizing the zip archive and just delivering it directly. It will then establish persistence with an auto run key. But they'll use names like Office, CEC, or other names that include extra characters. And then the downloaded zip contents, they'll contain additional malware, most commonly Net Support Manager rat, but we've also seen other things like Luma Stealer and CLC, less commonly. Okay. Atomic Stealer. We talked about this a little bit, and Brian talked about it a little bit. This is a stealer, and it warrants a bit of attention because it's targeting Mac OS devices, and Mac systems represent a really small percentage of the endpoints that we monitor. So its appearance on our top 10 list for the first half of this year really shows that this is an extremely prevalent threat on Mac OS devices. It's often delivered via pirated or cracked software and malicious advertisements that prompt the end user to download the malware. So just going through its attack path a little bit. So yeah, downloading Atomic Sealer can be relatively straightforward, and it can seem legitimate to unsuspecting users because it's almost indistinguishable from downloading legitimate software from the internet. And part of that is because it will have this AppleScript input prompt for credential access. It looks really legitimate, looks like something that your Mac might deliver to you. From there, it will start to collect all of the information that it's most interested in: credentials, payment card data, cookies, keychain details, information related to cryptocurrency wallets, etc. It will also escalate privileges as necessary to achieve its results. And then finally, it will exfiltrate the sensitive information that it's stolen. And at this point, you can assume your data has left the building. So we covered a lot here with a focus on those web-based threats, and particularly those ones that have an end game of stealing identities. So how can you defend against these threats? First of all, employ an ad blocking solution as you're able to on your browsers. And also allow block lists for browser extensions can be really helpful here. You can also implement a group policy object that forces .js attachments or other attachments that you know are not typically being opened within your user group to have those open in Notepad, and this will prevent them from auto-executing. And we actually have a blog on Red Canary's website that talks about this specifically, this open in Notepad idea. And then finally, of course, user education, updating your software, and investing in detection and response are always appropriate measures for these. So now I'll pass it back over to Brian, who's going to talk about the top techniques.
All right. Thanks, Alex. So yeah, I'm going to talk about top techniques. When we talk about techniques, we're talking about MITRE attack techniques, because that's the framework that we use to map threats, and I guess to map techniques, you should say. So these are like the smallest little components of an attack, like the very atomic bits of an attack that adversaries are carrying out. Let's see if I can get this slide move. There we go. All right, so just really high level here. If you look at these two lists, the one on the left is from our threat detection report. So that's calendar year 2023. And then on the right, we have the first half of 2024. You're going to notice immediately that the two lists are pretty similar. The three things that stand out, we've got highlighted in red, because these are the most emergent techniques over the last 18 months or so. All three are cloud native attacks that are enabled by identity, and we're going to dive into that in a minute. The 7 remaining attacks have been prevalent for years. They're going to continue to be prevalent for years to come. They're mostly intended for adversaries to execute, move laterally, elevate their privilege level, evade defensive controls, sometimes conduct reconnaissance or sort of obfuscate themselves. So there's basically like 20 or so techniques that move up and down in the top 10 or sort of drop out of the top 10 into the teens and come back in year out. But generally, there's not a lot of net new techniques jumping into this list. So let's run through the usual suspects here. These are techniques that we see every year. So at the top, we've got Windows management instrumentation. To a large extent, this is being driven by in-packet activity. So in-packet is a dual-use testing tool. It has a module in it called WMI exec that's driving a lot of this WMI attack activity. So beyond that, though, WMI, kind of a general little bin that probably a lot of you are familiar with. It's useful for admins and adversaries. It can enable configuration, execution, automation. Windows Command Shell is among the most ubiquitous lol bins. Like, it's kind of hard to do anything as an adversary without using Windows Command Shell, unless you're using PowerShell, which we'll get to in a minute. So Windows Command Shell can call on basically any binary on a system. It's on every Windows system, probably dating back to before I was born, maybe. It's obfuscatable. We see it a ton. And when we don't see it, we often see PowerShell. So as you can see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of our top 10 threats leverage PowerShell in one way or another. It's basically like Command Shell, but it has all these built-in commands that you can use for execution, lateral movement, ingress tool transfer. So like Command Shell, but better. And then the last usual suspect we have here is OS credential dumping. I should note, like, because of the weird ways that we count things, sometimes we have LSAS memory in our top 10, which is a sub-technique of OS credential dumping. Sometimes we have OS credential dumping. This is being driven in large part by Mimikatz, although there's a bunch of threats out there that go after credentials. And this is effectively a prerequisite for lateral movement and privilege escalation that adversaries almost have to use a lot of the times in an intrusion. So as I was saying before, sometimes we get threats that kind of bounce from the teens back into the tens, and they'll do this, depending on the year. These are examples of those kinds of techniques. So modify registry, this is getting leveraged by threats like Chrome Loader and Goot Loader. It facilitates a lot of other techniques. You can use it to run other techniques, but it also has sort of built-in capabilities that adversaries will use as well. You can use it to harvest credentials, bypass security, in addition to a number of other things. So service execution, pretty much every operating system has services running on it. These things are usually persistent and highly privileged, and they look normal, right? So it's a good way if an adversary can hijack a service to sort of blend in, but also execute code at a high level. Impacket leverages this among the threats we're looking at this year. And then last but not least here, we have renamed system utilities. We see a ton of this, right? If you're an adversary and you're leveraging a lolben to do something bad, sometimes it's really obvious. However, if you rename it, it's less obvious. So like think of it as maybe a silly example would be like using PowerShell to perform ingress tool transfer by grabbing a binary from the internet and pulling it down onto an endpoint. Like that might look suspicious depending on your environment. But if you rename PowerShell to Chrome, right, something that's literally designed to grab things from the internet and put them on your computer, it might seem less suspicious. So the newcomers, these were highlighted in red, I think, in that first slide. So cloud accounts, like from 2 years ago, it was ranked in the 40s among top attack techniques that we track. It dropped into the top 10 last year, and now it's in second place. Email forwarding rule has had a really, really similar path for us. And then email hiding rule is new to our top 10, but it's really, really closely related to email forwarding rules. And I'll explain this in a moment. Now, I'll note it's really rare for us to see techniques dive into our top 10. It almost never happens. And there's a variety of good reasons for that. And like this slide is basically going to summarize what those reasons are. So why is cloud accounts rising? There's a handful of reasons. Yes, there is increased attention from adversaries because the things that adversaries are after are increasingly in the cloud. But the reason for that is because IT teams, organizations, they moved to the cloud. They moved all their sensitive things to the cloud, and the adversaries have just been following them there. And that's not the only reason, though, because adversaries aren't the only people that followed your organizations into the cloud. We followed them as well, right? Like internal security teams have followed their organizations into the cloud, trying to secure all these new things. So have cloud service providers, right? Like we're getting better visibility, more log sources, better security controls from those cloud service providers. And at the same time, vendors like Red Canary are also following this migration into the cloud with additional security controls and more eyeballs looking at your cloud and looking for threats. So like those things together just mean we're finding more threats in the cloud as time goes on. And then really, really importantly, cloud accounts is an extremely broad technique. So like the dials and knobs that you kind of turn to do things in the cloud are basically like APIs and stuff in your cloud control plane. And in order to interface with any of that, you have to have a valid cloud account, right? So in a sense, nearly any bad activity that's happening in your cloud could potentially be mapped back to this cloud accounts technique. So those are kind of all the factors that are driving this rapid increase in valid cloud account activity. So email forwarding and hiding rules. The rise of these has been similar, has been sort of similar to cloud accounts. Now, the difference is email related activity is not new. And the reason this is jumping up our particular threat list has to do almost exclusively with us. So for a long, long time, Red Canary was an endpoint security company. We did detection and response on the endpoint. Now we do detection and response on the endpoint, the cloud, the network. your SaaS apps, email, etc. So as we've looked more and more and built more and more custom detection for email-related activity, these two techniques have shot up our list. So they are distinct but very similar techniques. Oftentimes, both of these techniques are happening concurrently. So like from a really high level, an email hiding rule would be any time that an adversary is sort of marking something as junk, blocking something, or even creating a forward rule to hide emails in a place you're unlikely to look, right? So that would be that circumstance where both things are happening at once. And then email forwarding rules are where you're creating rules to send emails to different places. Now, this could be an external account to do reconnaissance. It could be a folder to hide it from you. Again, that's where the overlap is happening here. And so some of the really common stuff that we see here is business email compromise scams, adversaries doing reconnaissance, looking for credentials or interesting information, and then just espionage, stealing information. So on the left here is kind of an example of what we see with email forwarding rules, although I think this could also technically be email hiding rules. So the first thing that happens is a bad guy will obtain a session token or a credential. They'll use that to log in via a compromised identity. They may perform reconnaissance on that inbox. And then they might create a rule, right, to automatically delete certain messages or send them to a junk folder where you're unlikely to look, right? Hide those emails from you. And then they might, send an email to the internal finance department, or maybe send an email to like a vendor who's going to pay you something, right? And they'll modify the payment information, maybe update the routing number and the bank account number so that instead of sending the money to where it's supposed to go, it gets sent to a place that the adversary controls, and then they take that money and they run for their lives. So what are the key takeaways here, right? We've got these three techniques that are all cloud native attacks that are being enabled by identity, right? Again, this identity is running straight through here. So what can security teams do about it? One big thing is implementing multi-factor authentication as far and wide as you possibly can, particularly for accounts that are doing secure things. Conditional access policies, you can do a ton with conditional access policies based on sort of elements of or properties of a login and where you allow or disallow logins to occur. You can also use conditional access policies to help enforce MFA. Behavioral and API monitoring are huge in the cloud. So as I said before, your cloud service providers have a bunch of logs that are going to give you really good visibility into what's going on in your cloud. And it's super important to not only understand what adversaries do, but you need to understand what normal behavior looks like in your cloud environment so that you can differentiate that from abnormal activity that may be malicious. And then ITDR is identity threat detection and response. So that's kind of like the operational end of the behavioral and API monitoring. So whatever logs you're using to monitor APIs and behaviors, you can either go out and find a product that does identity threat detection and response. You can develop your own identity threat detection and response program, but this is sort of the way of programmatically using those log sources and that visibility to detect what you know is malicious behavior in your environment. Passwordless solutions are a huge, huge benefit if you can implement them, whether it's biometrics or hard tokens like FIDO key things. And even if like that can be tricky to implement across the board, but like even doing it selectively, right? Like taking your Okta admins and making sure that those accounts are protected by hard tokens can be hugely beneficial to prevent sort of a mass identity compromise. And then also a lot of these cloud providers will have some sort of short-term access solution. So if someone's trying to access AWS, maybe you've got it federated through an identity provider. You log in through the identity provider, AWS gives you a token that lasts minutes or hours. And that way, if that token somehow gets taken, it gets invalidated very, very quickly. So I'm going to hand it off to Sam here because as you can see, through threats that are stealing credentials, through techniques that are identity centric, it's very, very clear to us when we look at the data that properly securing identities is super, super important. And we've spent the last probably 4 years digging deep into identity and the kinds of telemetry you get from identity providers, So Sam's going to kind of open the hood a bit and explain to you exactly how we go about doing identity threat detection and response that should be useful for you as you go and try and do this on your own.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Brian. Really excited to dig in and build on what we've talked about so far today. So, to the point at hand here, if you're looking at identity threats, it's a broad landscape that's sort of narrowly focused in the cloud, at least, on getting credentials and then using them, right, for whatever purpose you have. And so, to Brian's point, and Alex is at the beginning, right? We're moving and generally away from hacking in and towards the idea that adversaries are logging in or signing in. And so we think about that initial sign in by an adversary as initial access. These kind of overlap with the MITRE framework, but really we think about these just from an intellectual perspective to sort of think about how we go about building accurate detection and response. And so if you think about initial access, like how are they going to get those credentials in the first place to sign in? And what does it look like? The second sort of category are the two in the middle, post-compromise behaviors, right? This is what's happening inside the app or inside the IAM platform that is a result of the credentials being compromised. And all those are sort of undergirded by this idea of like things that are weird happen. And so just because something is anomalous or different doesn't mean it's malicious. But taken in combination with initial access vector or known post-compromise behavior, anomalous detections and the ability to look and see how different someone is behaving can be a really helpful piece of context. And so looking at these and combining them, what we do is we think about putting them together, right? When we think about an identity detection, it's focused on two things, right? Figuring out how certain are we that this is suspicious, and then how much context can we put into that investigation so that it's clear to anybody else looking at this what's going on. So when you think about initial access, it's a weak detection signal, right? At sign-in time, an adversary can look very similar to an admin, and especially if they're sophisticated and know how to cover their tracks. And so there's a ton of false positives for detections that happen just at that initial access stage. If you combine that with post-compromise behaviors, your detection signal starts to improve, right? And it's because these are sort of checkpoints or things that adversaries are known to do within their approach to getting done whatever it is. To use Brian's example of the email rule modifications in a BEC attack, it's a standard playbook, right? And they do this to cover their tracks. They do it effectively to cover their tracks, and so we can really dial in very precise detectors that are looking for these types of email rule modifications that lead us to investigate what's going on. But these things I would like to say are better together, right? We obviously look for and detect threats at initial access time. We look for and detect threats at post-compromise time. But if you can combine them and I pick all that context together, then you can see, okay, email rule was created. Well, is this somebody just doing their job? Let's go back and see how they authenticated in the first place, right? Were there any suspicious circumstances in this session that combined with the suspicious email rule, point us towards this being something of interest and maybe indicating a compromise. And so, that's labor intensive. These types of investigations, if you're conducting them in your SOC, I'm sure you'll agree with me, can be tedious and challenging, especially because there's just more and more providers out there and security tools that are offering up, hey, this is weird, this is suspicious, this is unusual logon behavior or user activity or whatever the alert may say. And so, the detection may be the easy part, right? Like, oh, okay, we found something strange. The hard part is running it down and figuring out if this is a compromised credential that's going to potentially impact your business, or just, normal behavior that looks a little different to the machine for whatever reason. As if it's vacation, somebody lost their cell phone and got a new one. A reorg puts somebody in a different seat than they were previously. it's hard to distinguish that from, an adversary who's actually in a different location or who's actually registered a new device for authentication purposes. And so, to make it efficient, I think it's key to be efficient because, the scale of these things is sort of astounding. We've worked to automate it. The way we're approaching that is this combination of just like good old fashioned coding, which is where we take our detection engineers and our analysts' insight. Brian was talking about all the different ways we can think about this. Alex is talking about these different ways that we can detect threats in this area. And we try to put that into code. And not just the detection part, but the investigation part. And so we put these things together and we say, okay, heuristically, someone signs in from a VPN, that could be potentially threatening. Somebody changes an inbox rule or a different setting within their IAM platform, that could be threatening. And so you can put these sequences of questions together, which are really just the questions that an analyst asks when they're running a KQL query or searching whatever database your security data is in, and putting that into a programmatic query that we can run at machine speed. And so we'll do 30 or 40 of these different queries when we get a suspicious login for a customer. And, that list of queries is sort of bespoke to the alert in question and curated by the team. But then you still have 30 or 40 query responses like sitting there somewhere. And so at that point, we're able to use some really targeted applications of generative AI to summarize these things. And this isn't a chatbot. This isn't anything commercial off the shelf. It's a really specific implementation where we take a ton of data and a ton of the responses to these like very curated analyst questions, and then we put them into a highly specific and sort of circumscribed prompt, and it comes back and gives a summary. It says, hey, given all the answers to those questions, I think this is suspicious, right? And so what it looks like is something like this. This is an example of what a flow investigation might look like. So an alert comes in, could be an alert, could be an event that we detect. It doesn't really matter. And then what happens, again, we've got questions. Was the login successful? Brian was talking about conditional access policies and MFA and FIDO keys, and there's a ton of logs. If you look at just a standard, well, it may vary by organization. If you look at somebody authenticating via Okta into Red Canary, it produces 11 distinct logs for just one authentication journey, right? Brian sits down in the morning, signs in to, post something. It's 11 logs just right there. And so, we want to see, was it actually successful? Did it clear conditional access? Did it clear MFA? If it was blocked somewhere along the line, you still may have an issue, but it's not actively exploited at this time, right? They haven't been able to achieve their goal, even if they are due for a password reset. As at that point, okay, the authentication is successful. Have we seen this behavior before? And there's a lot of different ways to characterize that, and this is where we get into the many dozens of questions that we ask. But have they used this VPN before? Have they used this VPN in combination with this user agent string before? Have they accessed this service before? These logins will sort of declare to you what underlying SaaS app that they're targeting at authentication time. And so you can start to profile and build what a good analyst would build, right? Okay, let's take a look and figure all this out. And then, you put all that information together, you run it through our specific prompt. And what you get is a sort of a recommendation, right? Hey, we should publish this threat. Here's what I went through. This is the computer talking here. They weren't blocked, or they got through conditional access. Things are weird in these specific ways. This is the data that I was able to get. This wasn't available. And then, a human being, which is still a really critical part of our process, gets to decide, okay, I can see the investigation that happened right at machine speed. Do I agree? Do I need to make an edit? Do I need to go make a final sort of ad hoc query? Or can I just say, yeah, I agree. The information is sort of clear here and we can publish this. Or, you know what? Like, I don't think this is worth sending to a customer for whatever reason. Let's keep it back. And so in this way, we're able to get through a massive amount of these suspicious alerts and investigate a ton of suspicious activity that we detect through our native detection analytics, because we have automation and tooling that helps us really capitalize on our years of experience in this space and all the data that is available through our integrations to do effective and efficient investigations. And so, I want to give an example of why this context not only is good for efficiency's sake, but it helps customers who are sort of on the receiving end. So let's dive into a quick example. So say, for example, we've got a suspicious activity, in this case in AWS, and it's an SSH session starting. Well, this by itself, while suspicious, obviously bears further investigation. And what the team does, and we just walked through with the flow investigations, is looking, what did the identity do before? And then what did it do after, right? By asking all these questions and having this data available in a database for our processes and our people to look at, we can take that stance of, okay, let's go contextualize this. Where did it happen? And the next slide sort of shows the results of that investigation, and we'll talk through them. So at initial access, after sort of looking through it, you can see that the user in question authenticated through Okta, they passed MFA, and Okta didn't assess any risk, right? They didn't flag this as risky or threatening. And then when they pivoted to AWS, everything was consistent, right? They were using an admin role that they'd used before. They had the same login context as the data we got from Okta, so same geolocation, ISP. So it looked consistent from that respect. And it only started to get suspicious when we hit SSH. And then after they, with the session that they started, they worked on achieving persistence and, sort of counterintelligence, detecting defenders that are spotting them doing what they're doing in the cloud, and then finally deploying a payload into this S3 bucket to achieve further persistence and, escalate their privileges. And so, from our just gut instinct here, this screams red teamer, right? This screams somebody who's got, a company laptop and signs in every day with their coffee, and on this day is testing their MDR provider or testing their systems or whatever security they've got, and is doing so by sort of going through this playbook of known suspicious activity with their, named Okta account and their named IAM account. Now, of course, we would still publish this to a customer because, red teamers like to hide or like to pretend to be threat actors. Threat actors like to pretend to be red teamers. You don't know definitively, but you can kind of pick it up intuitively. In either case, we're going to publish it as a normal threat. I think the way that this helps customers is that, if I back up here to the initial activity, this could raise some alarm bells. You've got a lot of work in front of you. We got to go figure out what's going on. Should I page somebody in? Do I need to, figure out what the heck's going on here? But if you get one of these in front of you, sort of a full story of what's happening and why it's weird or why it's not weird, you can start to get that intuition that, oh, this is a red teamer. I don't need to page in my boss. This is part of a known exercise that we're doing. And, thanks for catching this, but I'm going to move on with my normal activities for the day. So not only is the investigation and contextualization that we do, I think, help us be efficient and power through this data for customers, but it also helps us deliver a work product which is actionable and rich and helpful for the person who's ultimately responsible for dealing with it at the customer side, and reporting out on what happened. And so, we're really excited to sort of extend these types of investigations to new data sources and new threat techniques as the Intel team and the detection engineering pull those up. But I hope this has been helpful in sort of revealing how we go about these investigations and how do we try to approach them. With the few minutes I think we have left, we can take any questions that haven't been answered already in the chat.
Yeah, we've got a good question in here from Chris. I'll try and summarize it. I think the crux of what Chris is asking is there any framework or resource out there that helps organizations prioritize the log sources they should be collecting from, right? And so on the one side of this, like if you are a Red Canary customer, we have already done that work over the last decade to figure out what are the best data sources, and those are the ones that we collect from to do cloud or endpoint or network or whatever detection and response. However, this happens to be an area of security that I am super interested in, and the answer to your question is basically no. We wrote a guide maybe sometime this year about evaluating EDR, and it looked at basically endpoint log sources and data sources and sort of talked through the ones that you should really, really consider requiring of any EDR that you end up buying. The one resource that I will say has been super, super helpful to me is MITRE ATT&CK's data sources. So, and I've done a few talks where I've kind of talked about like collection prioritization based on those data sources. And the ways I've done it are twofold, basically. Every MITRE ATT&CK technique has associated data sources. So you can kind of programmatically go into attack and count all of the data sources and the amount of times they're referenced across techniques. And you basically come up with like a ranked list of how often a data source shows up across all the techniques in MITRE ATT&CK. And I think that like processes and commands were at the top, right? So like process monitoring and then command line monitoring would be two really important things. However, now that everything is much more cloudy, I think that somebody needs to go out and create like the definitive list for that. And I've tried to do it by looking through where we collect things at Red Canary, but that's a really limited view. I'd love to see something more universal that has widely different types of security tools, like people who specialize purely in network, people who specialize purely in email, people who specialize purely in endpoints, and sort of creating this ranked list of like, these are the 25 log sources or data sources or whatever at some level of abstraction that you should be collecting from. So that's kind of a long answer, that a long way of saying sort of, but kind of also no. But there are some resources out there that you can try and reason through. But yeah, I mean, I would start by looking through those data sources in MITRE ATT&CK and like really thinking through like, what do I have? What am I trying to protect? And where can I get the non-abstracted form of these data sources from these products, whether it's something like CloudTrail in AWS or audit logs in Azure, or, you know, process command line monitoring and whatever your EDR tool is. Let's see, do we have any other questions here?
Yeah, Brian, I've got a good one here behind it. Question is, how are the adversaries bypassing MFA? And it is even possible to bypass MFA to compromise accounts? Yeah, really great question. MFA is an amazing control, and it's a highly recommended and soon to be required by Microsoft line of defense for folks authenticating, but it's not fail safe, right? So a couple ways, and this is not an exhaustive list, but just a couple ways that, you know, they get around MFA is, first one is MFA exhaustion. And essentially what that means is you can compromise a password and a username, and then, you know, upon trying to authenticate, having, you know, whichever the end user is, get a prompt to say, hey, is this you authenticating? The user is supposed to say, no, that's not me. That's the point of MFA. But if you hammer somebody enough times, or you catch them at a strange moment, or maybe they thought they were authenticating or accepting that multi-factor authentication push from a different program, you know, you can trick the user into accepting an MFA that they didn't request. There's defenses against this, but it's definitely possible. Another one, which is, you know, sort of a cheater answer, is that attackers will go after accounts that aren't protected by MFA. And so, you know, as universally as we try to deploy MFA, you know, if some service accounts, older technology, you know, manufacturing equipment, you know, needs to be authenticated for long periods of time or just doesn't have the capability to use MFA. And attackers will target those sorts of accounts. And then another one is, essentially hijacking session tokens. So, getting a session which has already been authenticated and passed MFA. There's various ways that you can steal those and then replay them to essentially assume the session that, an authenticated user has already established. And then, there's other types of authentication, right? So if you're looking at, app-to-app authentication, attackers will pose as an application that, wow, that would be really useful if I had that tool on top of my Salesforce account. They'll authorize that via their truly authenticated Salesforce account, and then they'll have access into that data within the SaaS application without, MFA requirements. So that's, again, not an exhaustive list, but just a handful of things that we monitor and look out for. Really good question.
Yeah, and I can jump in here too. The other one that I mentioned a little bit earlier too is, and a trend that we've been seeing from adversaries is they're just being a little bit more aggressive with actually like getting on the phone. And so exploiting the help desk. This is something that we saw with Scattered Spider made popular, of calling the help desk, finding someone that's really helpful that will register that new MFA device for them. And then they can just log in directly. And then I think another one that maybe wasn't said quite yet was directing the user to a mirrored website that looks like the one that they're supposed to be logging into, but it's just slightly different. An I is an L in the URL, and they'll just put their credentials in. The adversary will then at the same time be putting them into the real website. It will direct that user for their MFA token. And again, like, because the user thinks they're on their legitimate company portal, they'll put their MFA token in there, and the adversary's just hijacking that as well.
Yeah, and I just shared 2 resources in the chat that I think cover everything that Sam and Alex just talked about between the 2 of them. So we have a bunch of research we did in the most recent threat detection report and the one before that on all the various ways that we were able to think of that we've seen or heard of adversaries overcoming MFA. So the short version of that question is there's a ton of ways to do it, but also at the same time, having any MFA is better than having no MFA at all. I think we're kind of up against it. I think this was only supposed to be a 45-minute thing, and it's turned into a 50-some minute thing. So we will, although it looks like lots of people have stuck around. So thank you for everyone who stuck around. Thank you for everyone who came. If any questions occur to you after you hang up, you're probably all going to receive an email that includes like a link to the recording of this. I think it will probably also include a PDF version of these slides. If you have a question that comes up then or later, you can just reply to that email with the question. That'll somehow magic its way back to us, and we'll reach out to you and answer the question. So thanks to everyone who came. Huge thanks to Sam and Alex for hosting this with me. And I hope you all have a delightful Thursday and a delightful weekend after that.